The betting started before she even reached the equipment cage. "Think the old lady even knows which end of a rifle to hold," whispered Petty Officer Third-Class Brandon Kowalski to his buddy. "$20, says she asked for help loading her magazine." The laughter rippled through the group of fresh-faced SEAL candidates as they watched the woman approach their training area at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. She moved with deliberate precision across the concrete, her weathered combat boots making no sound despite the early morning silence that hung over the Pacific coastline. The salty breeze carried the scent of kelp and diesel fuel from the harbor, mixing with the sharp tang of gun oil and sweat that perpetually clung to the training facilities. At 52, Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to irritate the younger men more than any loud proclamation of authority might have. Her graying hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and the lines around her dark eyes spoke of years spent squinting through scopes under foreign suns. The rookies saw only an aging woman who looked more like their mothers than their instructors. They had no context for the faded ribbon rack on her dress uniform hanging in her quarters, no understanding of the significance of certain classified decorations that would never see daylight. Kowalski elbowed his training partner, Seaman recruit Tyler Hendricks, whose baby face still showed traces of acne despite his 22 years. "Look at her trying to act all serious," Kowalski muttered under his breath. "But she's never seen real action. Probably spent her whole career pushing papers at some desk job." The comment drew snickers from the half-dozen candidates clustered around the weapons rack, their fresh utilities still creased from the base exchange. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar acts of courage where you're from, especially in military communities where veterans often face unfair assumptions about their capabilities. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training compound as Vasquez approached the group with measured steps. Her presence seemed to create a pocket of stillness in the bustling activity of the base, where helicopters thundered overhead and the distant sound of live fire exercises echoed from the ranges. The candidates straightened slightly, more from ingrained military bearing than any sense of respect for the woman before them. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Delacroix emerged from the equipment shed, his massive frame blocking the doorway as he surveyed the scene. His weathered face carried the map of 2 decades in special operations, with scars that told stories these rookies couldn't yet comprehend. He watched Vasquez approach with an expression that revealed nothing, though his eyes held a glimmer of anticipation that the younger men were too inexperienced to recognize. "Gentlemen," Delacroix announced in his gravelly Louisiana drawl, "you'll be working with Lieutenant Commander Vasquez today on advanced marksmanship techniques." His tone carried the weight of absolute authority, but several of the candidates exchanged glances that suggested they found the situation amusing rather than intimidating. Hendricks leaned closer to his companions, his voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for Vasquez to hear. "Wonder what her call sign is. Probably something boring like paperclip or file cabinet." The comment triggered another wave of suppressed laughter that rippled through the group like a stone thrown into still water. Vasquez stopped 3 feet from the gathered men, her hands clasped behind her back in a parade rest position that spoke of decades of military bearing. Her dark eyes swept across their faces with the same methodical attention she had once used to scan hostile territory through night vision goggles. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the seawall and the mechanical whine of a forklift moving equipment across the compound. The morning air carried the promise of another scorching San Diego day, with heat mirages already beginning to shimmer off the asphalt in the distance. Palm trees swayed gently in the ocean breeze, their fronds rustling with a sound like shuffling papers. The institutional gray buildings of the naval base stretched in all directions, their windows reflecting the climbing sun like 1,000 watching eyes. Kowalski cleared his throat and stepped forward slightly, his posture suggesting he had appointed himself spokesman for the group. "Ma'am," he began with exaggerated politeness, his tone carrying just enough sarcasm to be noticeable without being overtly disrespectful. "We were wondering about your call sign. For when we're communicating during exercises." His companions shifted behind him, barely containing their amusement at what they clearly considered a harmless bit of entertainment. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications and assumptions that would prove more dangerous than any of these young men could imagine. Vasquez regarded Kowalski with the same steady gaze she had once reserved for insurgents who thought they had the upper hand in firefights that would reshape their understanding of warfare forever. Vasquez let the silence stretch another 10 seconds, her expression unchanged as she studied each face in turn. The rookies shuffled uncomfortably under her steady gaze, their earlier confidence beginning to waver like smoke in an ocean breeze. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect in places where mistakes measured themselves in body counts rather than training scores. "Green Lady," she said simply, the two words falling into the morning air with unexpected weight. The candidates exchanged glances, clearly expecting something more elaborate or intimidating. Hendricks couldn't suppress a snort of laughter that escaped despite his attempt to maintain military bearing. "Green Lady," he repeated under his breath to Kowalski, his voice dripping with barely concealed amusement. "Sounds like something from a fairy tale. Maybe she grows vegetables or works in a garden center on weekends." The comment triggered another round of suppressed chuckle from the group, their respect for the woman before them diminishing with each passing moment. Chief Delacroix stepped forward from his position near the equipment shed, his expression darkening like storm clouds gathering over the Pacific. His massive hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled as if preparing to grab something or someone. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline seemed to pulse with barely contained irritation as he watched the candidate's disrespectful display. Seaman recruit Jake Morrison, a lanky kid from Tennessee whose drawl made every word sound lazy, leaned toward his companions with a grin spreading across his freckled face. "Y'all think maybe she got that name because she's always telling people to go green, like environmentally friendly and all that." His observation drew more snickers from the group, their confidence returning as they convinced themselves they were dealing with nothing more than an aging desk jockey playing soldier. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the training compound as the heat began to build toward the oppressive afternoon temperatures that would soon have everyone seeking shade. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their harsh cries mixing with the distant sound of surf and the mechanical noise of military vehicles moving across the base. The smell of aviation fuel drifted from the flight line, where helicopters prepared for training missions that would test other groups of young warriors. Vasquez remained motionless, her hands still clasped behind her back, watching the candidates with the patience of a predator who knew exactly when to strike. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of experiences these young men had never imagined, places where the color green had meant something entirely different from gardens or environmental consciousness. The ribbon rack on her dress uniform, stored safely in her quarters, included decorations that would have silenced their laughter permanently if they understood their significance. Petty Officer Second Class Devin Matthews, whose muscular build made him the unofficial leader among the physical specimens in the group, stepped closer to Vasquez with swagger that suggested he found the entire situation beneath his dignity. "Ma'am," he said with exaggerated patience, his tone suggesting he was addressing a confused elderly relative, "maybe you could tell us a little about your background. So we understand what kind of experience you're bringing to our training." His companions nodded approvingly, clearly viewing this as a reasonable request that would expose whatever administrative background they assumed she possessed. The question carried undertones of challenge that rippled through the group like electricity through water. They expected stories about logistics coordination or personnel management, tales of support roles that kept real warriors supplied and equipped. Their assumptions painted pictures of air-conditioned offices and computer screens, of meetings and paperwork rather than mud and blood, and the kind of split-second decisions that separated living heroes from honored dead. Chief Delacroix took another step forward, his boots scraping against the concrete with deliberate menace. The sound cut through the morning air like a blade being drawn from its sheath. His weathered face showed no expression, but those who knew him would have recognized the signs of barely controlled fury building behind his steady gaze. The candidates remained oblivious to the danger they were courting, their youth and inexperience blinding them to subtleties that might have saved them from the humiliation approaching like an incoming tide. Kowalski, emboldened by what he perceived as Vasquez's passive response to their questions, decided to push further into territory that would prove more treacherous than any battlefield he might someday face. "Chief," he said, turning toward Delacroix with a grin that suggested shared masculine understanding, "maybe you could give us some background on Green Lady here. Help us understand what we're working with today." His tone implied that he expected support from the senior enlisted man, some acknowledgement that this woman represented more burden than asset to their training schedule. The morning breeze shifted, carrying with it the salt tang of the Pacific and the distant sound of automatic weapons fire from the ranges where other military units honed skills that might soon be tested in places whose names appeared in classified briefings rather than tourist brochures. Palm fronds rustled overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the concrete like camouflage patterns shifting with the wind. Vasquez finally moved, a slight adjustment of her stance that somehow managed to project increased alertness without appearing threatening. Her movement was economical, precise, carrying the unconscious efficiency of someone who had learned to waste no motion when survival depended on speed and accuracy. The change was subtle enough that the candidates missed its significance entirely, their attention focused on what they perceived as an increasingly entertaining situation. The heat continued building as the sun approached its zenith, promising another day when temperatures would climb past comfortable into the realm where physical exertion became genuinely dangerous without proper preparation and respect for environmental conditions. Sweat began beading on foreheads despite the early hour, a reminder that even training exercises could prove hazardous when conducted with insufficient respect for the forces involved. The tension in Chief Delacroix's jaw became visible as Matthews continued his condescending assessment of the woman before them. His massive hands slowly curled into fists at his sides, the knuckles showing white beneath skin darkened by decades under tropical suns. The scar along his temple seemed to throb with each disrespectful comment from the candidates, a visible reminder of battles fought in places where respect was earned through blood rather than rank alone. Hendricks, encouraged by what he interpreted as silent approval from his companions, decided to escalate his commentary beyond whispered asides. "Ma'am," he said with mock seriousness, his baby face wearing an expression of exaggerated concern, "have you actually been in combat before? I mean real combat, not just training exercises or peacekeeping missions." His tone suggested he already knew the answer and found it lacking, his assumptions painting pictures of administrative assignments far from any genuine danger. The question hung in the morning air like the acrid smell of cordite after live fire exercises, carrying implications that would prove more explosive than any ordnance these young men had yet encountered in their abbreviated military careers. Vasquez regarded Hendricks with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout their interrogation, her dark eyes revealing nothing of the memories that question had triggered. Morrison stepped forward with his characteristic Tennessee swagger, his freckled face wearing a grin that suggested he viewed the entire situation as entertainment rather than military training. "Well now," he drawled, his accent thick as molasses in January, "I'm betting Green Lady here got her name from spending too much time in the rear with the gear, if you catch my meaning. Maybe she turned a little green around the gills when things got exciting." His observation drew appreciative chuckles from several candidates, who clearly found his theory both amusing and plausible. The morning sun continued its relentless climb toward zenith, transforming the concrete training area into a furnace that would soon test the endurance of anyone foolish enough to remain exposed without proper preparation. Heat waves began rising from the asphalt like transparent flames, distorting the view of distant buildings and creating an almost surreal quality to the confrontation unfolding in the weapons training area. Kowalski, sensing momentum building in their favor, decided to press what he perceived as their advantage over an aging woman who had clearly been assigned to their training rotation by mistake. "Chief Delacroix," he said, turning toward the senior enlisted man with confidence born of ignorance, "maybe we should request someone with more relevant experience for our advanced training. Someone who's actually been downrange and can teach us what we need to know for real-world operations." The words struck Delacroix like physical blows, each syllable adding fuel to a fire that had been building since the first disrespectful comment. His weathered face remained impassive, but those who knew him would have recognized the signs of a man approaching the limits of his legendary patience. The veins in his neck became visible as his blood pressure rose, and his breathing grew slightly deeper as he fought to maintain professional composure in the face of ignorance, so profound it bordered on criminal. Seaman recruit Carlos Jimenez, whose compact frame and quick movements marked him as the group's designated class clown, decided to add his contribution to what he perceived as harmless entertainment. "Hey, Green Lady," he called out with mock enthusiasm, his voice carrying across the training area like a challenge thrown down before armed opponents. "Maybe you could tell us about the most dangerous thing you ever faced in your military career. Was it a particularly aggressive filing cabinet or maybe a really stubborn copy machine?" The laughter that followed his comment was louder than before, emboldening the candidates to believe they had found a safe target for their humor. Their assumptions about military hierarchy and professional respect had been shaped by limited experience in controlled training environments where consequences remained theoretical rather than immediate and potentially fatal. Vasquez shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, the movement so subtle that only someone with extensive combat experience would have recognized it as a preparatory stance. Her hands remained clasped behind her back, but something in her posture suggested coiled energy waiting for the appropriate moment to be released. The change was lost on the candidates, whose attention remained focused on what they perceived as increasingly entertaining verbal sparring with an overmatched opponent. Chief Delacroix finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority tempered by barely controlled fury. "Candidates," he said, each word falling like hammer blows on anvil steel, "you are about to receive an education in respect and military bearing that will reshape your understanding of both concepts permanently." His tone suggested that the lesson would prove more memorable than comfortable, delivered by instructors whose qualifications extended far beyond anything these young men had yet encountered. The morning breeze carried new sounds across the training compound as other units began their daily routines. The distant crack of sniper rifles echoed from the long-range courses where marksmen honed skills that measured themselves in miles rather than meters. Helicopters thundered overhead in formations that spoke of missions requiring precision and coordination developed through years of experience in hostile environments, where mistakes carried consequences measured in body bags rather than training scores. Matthews, oblivious to the changing atmosphere around him, continued his assessment of the woman he viewed as an impediment to serious training. "Ma'am," he said with exaggerated patience, his muscular frame radiating confidence born of ignorance, "maybe you should consider stepping aside and letting Chief Delacroix handle our instruction today. We're here for advanced combat training, not sensitivity workshops or diversity presentations." His comment drew nods of agreement from several companions who clearly shared his assessment of the situation. The heat continued building as the sun climbed higher, promising temperatures that would soon transform the concrete training area into an oven capable of testing human endurance beyond comfortable limits. Sweat stains began appearing on utility uniforms despite the early hour, a reminder that even routine training exercises could prove hazardous when conducted without proper respect for environmental conditions and human limitations. The sound of approaching footsteps on concrete drew attention from the escalating confrontation as Master Chief Petty Officer Raymond Torres emerged from the administrative building. His presence carried the weight of 30 years in special operations, with silver hair that spoke of decades spent in places where younger men learned hard lessons about survival and respect. The ribbons on his uniform told stories that would have silenced the candidates permanently if they possessed the knowledge to read their significance properly. Torres surveyed the scene with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of warriors in environments where bravado proved less valuable than bullets. His weathered face showed no expression as he observed the candidates surrounding Vasquez, but something in his bearing suggested he was evaluating the situation with the same methodical attention he had once reserved for hostile territory reconnaissance. Jimenez, still riding the wave of what he perceived as successful humor, decided to include the newcomer in their entertainment. "Master Chief," he called out with mock enthusiasm, his voice carrying across the training area with the confidence of someone who believed himself among friends. "We were just asking Green Lady here about her combat experience. Think maybe you could help us understand what qualifications she brings to advanced SEAL training." The question struck Torres like a physical blow, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as he processed the implications of what he was witnessing. His hands moved to clasp behind his back in a position that mirrored Vasquez's stance, creating an unconscious display of solidarity that the candidates were too inexperienced to recognize. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, creating an almost ethereal quality that should have warned the younger men they were venturing into dangerous territory. Kowalski stepped forward with renewed confidence, interpreting Torres' silence as tacit approval for their line of questioning. "Master Chief," he said with exaggerated respect, his tone suggesting shared understanding between military professionals, "maybe you could explain why we're wasting training time with someone who probably hasn't seen action since the Cold War. We need instructors who understand modern warfare, not ancient history lessons from people who might have been competent decades ago." The words hung in the air like smoke from distant fires, carrying implications that would prove more incendiary than any explosive ordnance these young men had yet encountered in their limited military experience. Torres regarded Kowalski with the same steady attention he had once reserved for enemy combatants who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating American resolve and capability. Hendricks, emboldened by what he interpreted as growing support for their position, decided to escalate his commentary beyond previous boundaries. "Sir," he said with mock sincerity, his baby face wearing an expression of exaggerated concern, "don't you think our training would be more effective with instructors who actually understand current threats and modern combat techniques? Someone who's been in the fight recently, not someone whose experience comes from conflicts our grandfathers might remember." The morning breeze shifted, carrying with it new sounds from across the naval base as the daily rhythm of military operations began in earnest. The distant thunder of artillery exercises echoed from the ranges where other units practiced skills that might soon be tested in places whose names appeared in classified intelligence briefings rather than tourist guidebooks. Helicopters continued their endless patrols overhead, their rotor wash creating dust devils that danced across the concrete like spirits of fallen warriors seeking justice. Chief Delacroix finally reached the limits of his legendary patience, his massive frame tensing like a coiled spring preparing to release energy that had been building since the first disrespectful comment. His scarred face showed the kind of expression that had once struck fear into the hearts of insurgents who had made the mistake of underestimating American special operations capabilities. The veins in his neck became clearly visible as his blood pressure climbed beyond safe parameters. Morrison, oblivious to the changing atmosphere around him, continued his assessment with Tennessee confidence that bordered on criminal negligence. "Well now," he drawled, his freckled face wearing a grin that suggested he found the entire situation more entertaining than a Saturday night at the county fair, "I'm thinking maybe Green Lady here got her name because she spent too much time in the green zone, if you catch my meaning. Safe behind the wire, while real warriors did the heavy lifting in Indian country." The comment struck both Torres and Delacroix like physical blows, their expressions hardening into masks of barely controlled fury that should have warned any observant individual of impending consequences. The morning sun continued its relentless climb, transforming the concrete training area into a furnace that would soon test human endurance beyond comfortable limits, while creating an almost apocalyptic backdrop for the confrontation unfolding. Matthews, sensing what he perceived as momentum building in their favor, decided to press their apparent advantage with the kind of aggressive confidence that marked him as natural leadership material among his peer group. Master Chief Torres, he said with exaggerated formality, his muscular frame radiating the kind of physical confidence that came from years of successful athletic competition. Maybe we should request reassignment to instructors who can actually prepare us for what we'll face downrange. People who understand that modern warfare requires more than theoretical knowledge and peacetime experience. Vasquez remained motionless throughout the escalating commentary, her hands still clasped behind her back, watching the candidates with the same steady composure she had maintained since their first disrespectful observation. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of experiences these young men could never imagine, places where the color green had carried significance measured in survival rather than environmental consciousness or administrative assignments. Torres stepped closer to the group, his movement deliberate and measured like a predator approaching prey that had wandered too far from safety. His silver hair caught the morning light, creating an almost biblical quality to his appearance that should have warned the candidates they were about to receive an education and respect that would reshape their understanding of military hierarchy permanently. The heat continued building as the sun approached its zenith, promising another day when temperatures would climb past comfortable into the realm where physical exertion became genuinely dangerous without proper preparation and respect for environmental conditions. Sweat began appearing on foreheads despite the early hour, a reminder that even routine confrontations could prove hazardous when conducted with insufficient understanding of the forces involved. The arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb from the Base Operations Center added another layer of authority to the gathering storm. His crisp dress uniform bore the kind of ribbon rack that told stories of multiple combat deployments across 3 different theaters of operation, with decorations that spoke of leadership under fire rather than administrative excellence. The silver oak leaves on his collar caught the morning sunlight as he approached the group with measured steps that suggested he was evaluating a situation that had already escalated beyond acceptable parameters. Webb's presence should have served as a warning to the candidates that their entertainment was approaching dangerous territory, but their youth and inexperience blinded them to the subtle signs that marked the difference between routine training interactions and potentially career-ending confrontations. His weathered face carried the map of 25 years in special operations, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting through desert heat and jungle humidity while making decisions that affected the lives of men under his command. Jimenez, interpreting the arrival of additional senior personnel as validation of their concerns about inadequate instruction, decided to include the newcomer in their assessment of the situation. Colonel Webb, he said with mock respect, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from never having faced genuine consequences for poor judgment, we were discussing whether Green Lady here has the kind of current experience we need for advanced combat training. Maybe you could help us understand her background and qualifications. The question struck Webb like incoming artillery, his expression shifting from neutral observation to something approaching controlled fury as he processed the implications of what he was witnessing. His hands moved to clasp behind his back in an unconscious display of solidarity with Vasquez, creating a formation of senior personnel that should have warned any observant individual of impending educational consequences. Kowalski, emboldened by what he perceived as growing interest from the officer corps in their legitimate concerns about training quality, stepped forward with a kind of aggressive confidence that had served him well in college athletics, but proved less valuable in military environments where respect was earned through performance rather than potential. "Sir," he said with exaggerated formality, his tone suggesting shared understanding between military professionals, "don't you think our preparation would be more effective with instructors who understand current threat environments and modern combat techniques?" The morning air grew thick with tension as the candidates continued their verbal assault on a woman whose true qualifications would have struck them speechless if they possessed the security clearances necessary to access her complete service record. The sound of distant gunfire from the training ranges created a percussion backdrop that seemed to emphasize the approaching confrontation, while helicopters continued their endless patrols overhead like mechanical vultures circling above a battlefield. Matthews decided to escalate his commentary with the kind of direct challenge that marked him as someone who had never learned the valuable lesson that some mountains were better left unclimbed. "Colonel," he said, his muscular frame radiating physical confidence that had never been tested against opponents who possessed the capability to permanently adjust his attitude. "Maybe we should address the elephant in the room here. This woman clearly doesn't have the kind of recent combat experience that justifies her presence in our training rotation." Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he listened to the continued disrespect being directed toward a woman whose service record included operations that remained classified at levels these candidates would never achieve during their military careers. His eyes moved between the speakers with the same methodical attention he had once reserved for target acquisition in hostile territory, cataloging faces and names for future reference. Hendricks, convinced that their growing audience represented validation of their concerns rather than gathering storm clouds, decided to press their apparent advantage with the kind of persistence that had served him well in academic environments, but proved dangerous in situations where consequences extended beyond poor grades. "Sir," he said with mock sincerity, his baby face wearing an expression of exaggerated concern, "we're just trying to ensure we receive the highest quality training possible. Someone with Green Lady's background might be better suited for administrative assignments rather than advanced combat instruction." The comment hung in the morning air like the acrid smell of cordite after live fire exercises, carrying implications that would prove more explosive than any ordnance these young men had encountered during their abbreviated military training. Chief Delacroix's massive hands slowly curled into fists at his sides, while Master Chief Torres's expression hardened into the kind of mask that had once struck fear into the hearts of enemy combatants who had underestimated American resolve. Morrison, still riding the wave of what he interpreted as successful humor, decided to add his Tennessee perspective to what he viewed as a legitimate discussion about training quality. "Well now," he drawled, his freckled face wearing a grin that suggested he found the entire situation more entertaining than educational, "I'm thinking maybe we should get someone who's actually been in the shit recently, if you'll pardon my French. Someone who understands that warfare ain't what it used to be back in Green Lady's day." The morning sun continued its relentless climb toward zenith, transforming the concrete training area into a furnace that would soon test human endurance, while creating an almost biblical backdrop for the confrontation unfolding between ignorance and experience. Heat waves began rising from the asphalt like transparent flames, distorting the view of distant buildings and adding a surreal quality to the gathering that would soon reshape these young men's understanding of military hierarchy. Lieutenant Colonel Webb finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority tempered by barely controlled fury that should have warned any intelligent observer of impending consequences. "Candidates," he said, each word falling like hammer blows on anvil steel, "you are about to receive an education in respect, military bearing, and the consequences of making assumptions about personnel whose qualifications extend far beyond your current ability to comprehend." Vasquez remained motionless throughout the escalating commentary, her hands still clasped behind her back, watching the candidates with the same steady composure she had maintained since their first disrespectful observation. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of operations conducted in places these young men had never heard of, missions that remained classified at levels requiring congressional oversight rather than routine security clearances. The heat continued building as the morning progressed toward what promised to be another scorching San Diego day, with temperatures that would soon climb past comfortable into the realm where physical exertion became genuinely dangerous without proper preparation and respect for environmental conditions that had claimed more warriors than enemy action in certain theaters of operation. The sound of boots on concrete announced the arrival of Command Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Blake, whose presence commanded instant attention from anyone with sufficient military experience to recognize her significance in the special operations community. Her uniform bore the kind of warfare devices and ribbons that told stories of operations conducted in places where congressional oversight extended only to classified briefings and casualty reports. The trident on her chest gleamed in the morning sunlight, a symbol that represented years of proving herself in environments where gender became irrelevant compared to capability and courage under fire. Blake surveyed the scene with eyes that had witnessed the evolution of special operations from a predominantly male domain into a more inclusive force that measured warriors by performance rather than presumptions. Her weathered face showed the kind of composure that came from surviving situations where panic meant death and clear thinking represented the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The candidates remained oblivious to her significance, their attention focused on what they continued to perceive as entertainment rather than impending educational consequences. Jimenez, still convinced that their growing audience represented validation of legitimate concerns about training quality, decided to include the senior enlisted woman in their assessment of the situation. "Command Master Chief," he said with mock respect, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that had never been tested against opponents capable of permanently adjusting his perspective on military hierarchy, "we were discussing whether our instructors should have more current combat experience. Maybe you could weigh in on the qualifications needed for advanced SEAL training." The question struck Blake like incoming mortar fire, her expression shifting from neutral observation to something approaching controlled fury as she processed the implications of witnessing junior personnel questioning the credentials of someone whose service record included operations that remained classified at levels requiring presidential authorization. Her hands moved to clasp behind her back in an unconscious display of solidarity with Vasquez, creating a formation of senior personnel that resembled a tribunal preparing to render judgment. Kowalski, interpreting Blake's silence as tacit approval for their line of questioning, stepped forward with renewed confidence that bordered on criminal negligence. "Command Master Chief," he said with exaggerated formality, his tone suggesting shared understanding between military professionals, "don't you think Green Lady here might be better suited for support roles rather than direct combat instruction? We need trainers who understand modern threats and current operational procedures." The morning breeze carried new sounds across the naval base as the daily rhythm of military operations continued around the escalating confrontation. The distant crack of sniper rifles echoed from the precision shooting courses where other marksmen honed skills that measured themselves in fractions of inches across distances that challenged human capability. Aircraft engines roared to life on the flight line, preparing for missions that would test pilot skills in environments where mistakes carried consequences measured in aircraft losses rather than training scores. Matthews, sensing what he perceived as momentum building in their favor, decided to press their apparent advantage with the kind of aggressive directness that had served him well in competitive athletics, but proved dangerous in military environments where respect was earned through proven performance rather than physical potential. "Ma'am," he said, his muscular frame radiating confidence that had never been tested against genuine opposition, "maybe you could help us understand why we're spending valuable training time with someone whose experience might not be relevant to current operational requirements." Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she listened to the continued assault on a woman whose qualifications included operations that had shaped American foreign policy in ways these candidates would never be clear to understand. Her eyes moved between the speakers with the same methodical attention she had once reserved for threat assessment in hostile territory, cataloging faces and voices for future reference in what was rapidly becoming a case study in military bearing and professional respect. Hendricks, convinced that their expanding audience represented growing support for their position rather than gathering storm clouds, decided to escalate his commentary with the kind of persistence that had served him well in academic environments, but proved hazardous in situations where consequences extended beyond poor evaluations. "Command Master Chief Blake," he said with mock sincerity, his baby face wearing an expression of exaggerated concern. "We're just trying to ensure we receive training that prepares us for real-world operations. Someone with more recent downrange experience might be better qualified to teach advanced combat techniques." The comment hung in the morning air like smoke from distant battles, carrying implications that would prove more explosive than any ordnance these young men had encountered during their limited exposure to military training environments. The gathering of senior personnel around Vasquez began to resemble a protective formation, their combined presence creating an atmosphere of impending consequences that should have warned any observant individual of approaching educational adjustments. Morrison, still operating under the assumption that his humor was appreciated rather than offensive, decided to add his Tennessee perspective to what he continued to view as legitimate discussion about instructor qualifications. "Well now," he drawled, his freckled face wearing a grin that suggested he found the entire situation more entertaining than threatening. "I'm thinking maybe Green Lady here got her name because she turned green the first time she heard incoming fire. Maybe spent too much time losing her lunch instead of returning effective fire downrange." The observation drew appreciative chuckles from several candidates who clearly found his theory both amusing and plausible, their assumptions about combat stress and gender-based limitations blinding them to the reality that they were mocking someone whose performance under fire had earned recognition at levels they would never achieve during their military careers. The laughter rippled through the group like electricity through water, each sound adding fuel to fires that had been building since their first disrespectful comment. Chief Delacroix's massive hands slowly curled into fists at his sides, his scarred face showing the kind of expression that had once struck terror into the hearts of insurgents who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating American special operations capabilities. Master Chief Torres's silver hair caught the morning light as his weathered features hardened into a mask of barely controlled fury that spoke of approaching consequences measured in career adjustments rather than simple disciplinary actions. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stepped closer to the group, his movement deliberate and measured like a predator approaching prey that had wandered too far from the safety of their natural habitat. His dress uniform bore witness to decades of leadership in environments where poor judgment carried consequences measured in body counts rather than administrative reprimands, and his expression suggested that educational opportunities were about to be provided whether the recipients desired them or not. The morning sun continued its relentless climb toward zenith, transforming the concrete training area into a furnace that would soon test human endurance while creating an almost apocalyptic backdrop for the confrontation that was rapidly approaching its inevitable conclusion. Heat waves began rising from the asphalt like spirits of fallen warriors seeking justice for disrespect shown to one of their own. The atmosphere on the training compound shifted perceptibly as more personnel began gathering around the escalating confrontation, drawn by the unmistakable tension that crackled through the morning air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Instructors from adjacent training areas paused their activities to observe what was rapidly becoming a textbook example of how quickly military careers could be derailed through poor judgment and insufficient respect for chain of command protocols. Petty Officer First Class Derek Hamilton emerged from the communications facility, his uniform bearing the insignia of someone who had spent considerable time coordinating operations that required precise timing and flawless execution under hostile conditions. His weathered face showed the kind of composure that came from managing life-and-death communications in environments where static on the radio often meant warriors would never return home to families who waited anxiously for news of their safe return. Hamilton surveyed the scene with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of operations in theaters where American interests were protected by men and women whose sacrifices rarely received public recognition. His presence added another layer of senior oversight to what was becoming an increasingly dangerous situation for the candidates, who remained oblivious to the gathering storm clouds of professional consequences surrounding their entertainment. Kowalski, interpreting the arrival of additional personnel as validation of their concerns about training quality, decided to expand their audience participation in what he continued to view as legitimate questioning of instructor qualifications. Petty Officer Hamilton, he said with mock formality, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that had never been tested against opponents capable of permanently adjusting his understanding of military respect. Maybe you could help us understand why we're working with instructors whose experience might not be current enough for modern SEAL operations. The question struck Hamilton like incoming rocket-propelled grenades, his expression shifting from neutral observation to barely controlled fury as he processed the implications of witnessing junior personnel systematically disrespecting someone whose service record included operations that had shaped American military doctrine in ways these candidates would never be clear to comprehend. His hands moved to clasp behind his back in solidarity with the growing formation of senior personnel surrounding Vasquez. Matthews, sensing what he perceived as growing interest from the professional military education community in their legitimate concerns about instructor currency, stepped forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that marked him as someone who had never learned that some battles were better left unfought. Hamilton, he said, his muscular frame radiating physical assurance that had never been tested against genuine opposition. Don't you think our advanced training would be more effective with people who understand current threat environments and modern combat techniques rather than historical perspectives? The morning sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, transforming the naval base into a furnace that would soon test human endurance beyond comfortable limits, while creating an almost biblical backdrop for the confrontation that was approaching its inevitable climax. The sound of aircraft engines provided a constant percussion as helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft conducted their endless patrols and training missions across the Southern California coastline. Hendricks, convinced that their expanding audience represented growing support for their position rather than gathering witnesses to their professional suicide, decided to escalate his commentary with the kind of academic persistence that had served him well in classroom environments but proved hazardous in military situations where consequences extended far beyond poor grades. Petty Officer Hamilton, he said with mock sincerity, his baby face wearing an expression of exaggerated concern, we're just trying to ensure we receive training that actually prepares us for what we'll face in real-world operations downrange. The comment hung in the morning air like the acrid smell of high explosives after demolition training, carrying implications that would prove more destructive than any ordnance these young men had encountered during their limited exposure to military training environments. The formation of senior personnel around Vasquez continued to grow, creating an almost protective circle that should have warned any intelligent observer of approaching educational consequences. Morrison, still operating under the delusion that his humor was appreciated rather than offensive, decided to contribute his Tennessee wisdom to what he continued to view as entertaining discourse about military training standards. Well now, he drawled, his freckled face wearing a grin that suggested he found the entire situation more amusing than ominous. I'm betting Green Lady here got her name because she spent too much time in the latrine during her first firefight. You know how some folks get when the shooting starts and things get real exciting real fast. The observation drew more appreciative laughter from the candidates, their assumptions about combat stress and gender-based performance limitations blinding them to the reality that they were systematically destroying their military careers through disrespect directed towards someone whose combat record included operations that remained classified at levels requiring congressional oversight and presidential authorization. Jimenez, emboldened by what he interpreted as successful entertainment value in his previous contributions, decided to escalate his commentary beyond previous boundaries with the kind of reckless abandon that marked him as someone who had never faced genuine consequences for poor judgment. "Hey, Green Lady," he called out with mock enthusiasm, his compact frame practically vibrating with misplaced confidence. Maybe you could tell us about the most dangerous situation you ever faced in your military career. Was it a particularly aggressive stapler, or maybe a really stubborn printer that wouldn't cooperate during an important briefing? The laughter that followed his comment was louder and more sustained than before, encouraging the candidates to believe they had found safe harbor in their systematic humiliation of a woman whose true qualifications would have struck them speechless if they possessed the security clearances necessary to access even the unclassified portions of her service record. Chief Delacroix's massive frame tensed like a coiled spring preparing to release energy that had been building since the first disrespectful observation. His scarred face showed the kind of expression that had once reduced hardened insurgents to trembling compliance, while his hands curled into fists that spoke of approaching physical consequences for continued disrespect. Master Chief Torres's silver hair caught the morning light as his weathered features hardened into a mask of barely controlled rage that promised educational opportunities whether the recipients desired them or not. Command Master Chief Blake stepped closer to the group, her movement deliberate and predatory like an apex hunter approaching prey that had wandered too far from the safety of their natural environment. Her uniform bore witness to operations conducted in places where congressional representatives feared to tread, and her expression suggested that lessons in military bearing were about to be administered with the kind of thoroughness that would reshape these young men's understanding of respect permanently. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's jaw muscles worked visibly as he listened to the continued assault on a woman whose service record included decorations that required presidential authorization to award. His eyes moved between the speakers with the methodical attention of someone cataloging targets for future reference, while his bearing suggested that career counseling sessions were about to be scheduled with the kind of urgency typically reserved for emergency medical situations. The sound of measured footsteps announced the arrival of Captain Daniel Rodriguez from the base command structure, his dress uniform bearing the kind of warfare insignia that marked him as someone who had commanded operations in multiple theaters where American interests were protected through decisive action rather than diplomatic negotiation. The gold oak leaves on his collar caught the morning sunlight as he approached the gathering with the deliberate pace of someone evaluating a situation that had clearly escalated beyond acceptable parameters of military professionalism. Rodriguez possessed the kind of presence that commanded instant respect from anyone with sufficient experience to recognize the significance of his decorations and the weight of responsibility they represented. His weathered face showed the map of 15 years in Special Operations Command positions, with lines around his eyes that spoke of making decisions under hostile fire that affected the lives and futures of warriors under his protection. The candidates should have recognized his arrival as the final warning that their entertainment was approaching territory that could permanently alter their military careers. But their youth and inexperience continued to blind them to the gathering storm of professional consequences surrounding their systematic disrespect of a woman whose true qualifications remained hidden behind classifications they would never possess. Kowalski, interpreting the captain's arrival as validation of their concerns about training quality, stepped forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that had never been tested against opponents capable of ending military careers with a single phone call. "Captain Rodriguez," he said with exaggerated formality, his voice carrying the dangerous certainty of someone who believed himself among supportive allies. "We were discussing the qualifications of our training personnel. Maybe you could help us understand why Green Lady here is assigned to advanced SEAL instruction when her background might be more suited to administrative or support functions." The question struck Rodriguez like incoming artillery, his expression shifting from neutral assessment to something approaching controlled fury as he processed the implications of witnessing junior personnel systematically undermining the credibility of someone whose service record included operations that had influenced American foreign policy at levels requiring cabinet-level briefings and congressional oversight. Matthews, sensing what he perceived as growing command interest in their legitimate concerns about instructor currency, decided to press their apparent advantage with the kind of direct challenge that marked him as someone who had never learned the valuable military lesson that discretion often proved more valuable than valor. "Sir," he said, his muscular frame radiating confidence that had never been tested against genuine opposition, "don't you think our preparation for real-world operations would be more effective with instructors who understand current threats and modern combat environments rather than historical perspectives that might not reflect contemporary realities?" The morning air grew thick with tension as the systematic assault on Vasquez's credibility continued despite the gathering of senior personnel whose combined experience represented decades of leadership in environments where respect was earned through blood rather than rhetoric. The sound of distant explosions from the demolition ranges provided an ominous percussion backdrop that seemed to emphasize the approaching confrontation between ignorance and experience. Hendricks, convinced that their expanding audience represented growing validation of their position rather than accumulating witnesses to their professional destruction, escalated his commentary with the kind of academic persistence that had served him well in classroom environments but proved catastrophically dangerous in military situations where consequences extended far beyond poor evaluations. "Captain Rodriguez," he said with mock sincerity, his baby face wearing an expression of exaggerated concern, "we're just trying to ensure we receive training that actually prepares us for what we'll encounter in operational environments downrange where lives depend on current knowledge and relevant experience." Rodriguez's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he listened to the continued disrespect being directed toward a woman whose combat record included decorations that required presidential authorization to award. His hands moved to clasp behind his back in an unconscious display of solidarity with the protective formation that had developed around Vasquez, creating a tribunal of senior leadership that resembled a court-martial panel preparing to render judgment. Morrison, still operating under the delusion that his humor was entertaining rather than career-ending, decided to contribute his Tennessee perspective to what he continued to view as harmless entertainment about military training standards. "Well now," he drawled, his freckled face wearing a grin that suggested he found the entire situation more amusing than ominous. "I'm thinking maybe Green Lady here got her name because she turned green around the gills the first time she had to clean her weapon after a firefight. You know how some folks react to the smell of cordite and brass when the adrenaline wears off and reality sets in?" The observation drew sustained laughter from the candidates, their assumptions about combat stress and gender-based performance limitations continuing to blind them to the reality that they were witnessing the systematic destruction of their own military futures through disrespect directed towards someone whose true qualifications would have reduced them to stammering apologies if they possessed even basic security clearances. Jimenez, encouraged by what he interpreted as successful comedic timing in his previous contributions, decided to escalate his commentary beyond all previous boundaries with the kind of reckless abandon that marked him as someone destined for early separation from military service. "Hey, Green Lady," he called out with mock enthusiasm, his compact frame practically radiating misplaced confidence. "Maybe you could demonstrate some of those advanced combat techniques you're supposed to teach us. Show us how to properly surrender when things get too scary. Or maybe the correct procedure for hiding behind cover until the real warriors finish the job." The comment struck the gathered senior personnel like incoming mortar rounds, each word adding fuel to fires that had been building since the first disrespectful observation. Chief Delacroix's massive hands slowly curled in a fist that spoke of approaching physical education for anyone foolish enough to continue their assault on a woman whose service record included operations that had saved American lives in places these candidates had never heard of. Master Chief Torres's silver hair caught the morning light as his weathered features hardened into a mask of barely controlled rage that promised immediate and permanent adjustments to the military careers of anyone who continued their systematic disrespect. Command Master Chief Blake stepped closer to the group with predatory grace that suggested educational opportunities were about to be provided with the kind of thoroughness typically reserved for enemy combatants who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating American resolve. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's dress uniform bore witness to decades of leadership in environments where poor judgment carried consequences measured in casualty reports rather than administrative counseling, and his expression suggested that career guidance was about to be administered with the urgency typically reserved for medical emergencies. Captain Rodriguez moved to complete the circle of senior leadership surrounding the candidates, his presence adding the weight of command authority to what was rapidly becoming a tribunal of military justice. Vasquez remained motionless throughout the escalating assault on her credibility, her hands still clasped behind her back, watching the candidates with the same steady composure she had maintained since their first disrespectful comment. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of operations conducted in places where congressional oversight extended only to classified briefings and casualty notifications, missions that remained hidden behind security classifications requiring presidential authorization to access. The morning sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the training compound as the confrontation approached its inevitable climax. The gathered circle of senior personnel created an almost ceremonial atmosphere, their combined presence representing decades of combat leadership and operational experience that these candidates were too inexperienced to comprehend. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension as the systematic disrespect reached levels that demanded immediate and decisive response. Kowalski, completely oblivious to the gathering storm of professional consequences surrounding him, decided to deliver what he perceived as the final blow to Green Lady's credibility with the kind of swagger that marked him as someone destined for early separation from military service. "You know what?" he announced to his companions with theatrical confidence, his voice carrying across the training area like a battle cry before a disastrous charge. "I bet Green Lady here never even fired her weapon in anger. Probably spent her whole deployment in the chow hall making sure the real warriors got fed while they did the actual fighting." The comment struck the assembled senior personnel like incoming cruise missiles, each word adding explosive force to fires that had been building since the first disrespectful observation. The formation of experienced warriors surrounding Vasquez tightened almost imperceptibly, their combined presence creating an atmosphere of impending judgment that should have warned any intelligent observer of approaching consequences measured in career destruction rather than simple disciplinary action. Matthews stepped forward with his characteristic aggressive confidence, his muscular frame radiating the kind of physical assurance that had never been tested against opponents capable of permanently adjusting his understanding of military hierarchy. "Yeah," he said with theatrical authority, his voice carrying the dangerous certainty of someone who believed himself invulnerable to consequences. "Green Lady probably got her name because she spent too much time in the rear echelon where everything was safe and green instead of downrange where the real action happened. Probably never even heard a shot fired in anger, much less returned effective fire against actual enemies." The morning breeze carried new sounds across the naval base as the daily rhythm of military operations continued around the escalating confrontation that was rapidly approaching its moment of truth. The distant thunder of artillery exercises provided an ominous backdrop that seemed to emphasize the approaching collision between ignorance and experience, while helicopters continued their endless patrols overhead like mechanical angels of justice preparing to witness divine retribution. Hendricks, convinced that their systematic destruction of Green Lady's credibility represented legitimate questioning of instructor qualifications rather than career suicide, decided to add his contribution to what he perceived as victorious momentum. "I'm betting," he said with mock academic authority, his baby face wearing an expression of exaggerated analysis, "that Green Lady here never even completed a combat deployment. Probably got her ribbons from training exercises and humanitarian missions where the biggest threat was paperwork deadlines and logistics coordination rather than actual enemy contact." The observation drew appreciative nods from his companions, who clearly found his assessment both logical and satisfying. Their assumptions about gender-based limitations and administrative assignments continued to blind them to the reality that they were witnessing the systematic destruction of their own military futures through disrespect directed towards someone whose true qualifications remained hidden behind security classifications they would never achieve. Morrison, riding the wave of what he interpreted as successful group entertainment, decided to contribute his Tennessee wisdom to what he continued to view as harmless discourse about military experience and combat credentials. "Well now," he drawled with theatrical confidence, his freckled face wearing a grin that suggested he found the entire situation more amusing than educational. I'm thinking maybe Green Lady here got her name because she turned green as grass the first time someone mentioned the possibility of actual combat. Probably requested immediate transfer to the safest assignment available rather than risk exposure to genuine danger. Jimenez, encouraged by the sustained laughter that followed Morrison's observation, decided to escalate his commentary to levels that would prove catastrophic for his military career. "Hey, Green Lady," he called out with mock enthusiasm, his compact frame practically vibrating with misplaced confidence. "Maybe you could tell us about your most harrowing combat experience. Was it the time the coffee machine broke down during a training exercise, or maybe when the air conditioning failed during a particularly intense PowerPoint presentation about battlefield safety?" The comment triggered the loudest laughter yet from the candidates, their amusement reaching levels that created an almost carnival atmosphere around what was rapidly becoming the final moments of their military careers. Their assumptions about administrative assignments and support roles continued to fuel their entertainment, blinding them to the gathering storm of professional consequences that surrounded them like incoming artillery. Chief Delacroix's massive frame tensed like a nuclear weapon preparing for detonation, his scarred face showing the kind of expression that had once reduced hardened insurgents to begging for mercy. His hands curled into fists that spoke of approaching physical education for anyone foolish enough to continue their assault on a woman whose service record included operations that had prevented American casualties in places these candidates would never be cleared to know existed. Master Chief Torres stepped closer to the group with the deliberate movement of a predator approaching prey that had wandered too far from safety. His silver hair caught the harsh sunlight as his weathered features hardened into a mask of barely controlled fury that promised immediate and permanent career adjustments for anyone who continued their systematic disrespect of a warrior whose qualifications extended far beyond their ability to comprehend. Command Master Chief Blake moved to tighten the circle of senior leadership surrounding the candidates, her presence adding the weight of Special Operations Authority to what was rapidly becoming a tribunal of military justice. Her uniform bore witness to operations conducted in places where American interests were protected through decisive action rather than diplomatic negotiation, and her expression suggested that educational opportunities were about to be provided with thoroughness typically reserved for enemy combatants. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's jaw muscles worked visibly as he listened to the continued assault on a woman whose combat record included decorations that required congressional authorization to award. His dress uniform bore witness to decades of leadership under hostile fire, and his bearing suggested that career counseling was about to be administered with the kind of urgency typically reserved for medical emergencies requiring immediate intervention. Captain Rodriguez completed the formation of senior personnel surrounding the candidates, his gold oak leaves catching the sunlight as he prepared to deliver consequences that would reshape these young men's understanding of military respect permanently. His weathered face showed the kind of composure that came from commanding operations where poor judgment carried consequences measured in casualty reports rather than administrative reprimands, and his expression suggested that lessons in military bearing were about to commence, whether the recipients desired them or not. The moment of reckoning arrived with a subtle shift of weight that marked Vasquez's transition from passive observer to active participant in what was about to become the most educational experience of these candidates' abbreviated military careers. Her hands slowly unclasped from behind her back, the movement so deliberate and controlled that it seemed to draw energy from the morning air itself, transforming the atmosphere from tension into something approaching reverence. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as he prepared to deliver information that would permanently alter these young men's understanding of military hierarchy and professional respect. "Gentlemen," he announced, his words falling like hammer blows on anvil steel, "you have been questioning the qualifications of Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, call sign Green Lady, whose service record includes operations that remain classified at levels requiring presidential authorization to access. The captain's announcement struck the candidates like incoming mortar rounds, each word adding explosive force to their growing realization that they had ventured far beyond acceptable boundaries of military discourse in a territory that would prove catastrophic for their careers. Kowalski's swagger began to falter as the implications of Rodriguez's tone penetrated his consciousness, while Matthews's muscular frame seemed to deflate slightly as professional reality intruded upon his assumptions. Rodriguez continued his revelation with the methodical precision of someone delivering classified briefings to congressional oversight committees. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez earned her call sign during Operation Jade Serpent in Afghanistan, where she spent 14 months embedded with forward operating bases conducting precision elimination of high-value targets behind enemy lines. Her confirmed kill count includes 47 enemy combatants eliminated at ranges exceeding 800 meters under hostile fire conditions. The information struck the gathered candidates like lightning from clear skies, their assumptions about administrative assignments and support roles crumbling like ancient fortifications under modern artillery bombardment. Hendrix's baby face went pale as the magnitude of his miscalculations became apparent, while Morrison's freckled features showed the kind of shock comprehension typically reserved for soldiers experiencing their first taste of actual combat. Master Chief Torres stepped forward to add his contribution to the educational process that was reshaping these young men's understanding of military service and combat experience. Green Lady, he announced with the gravity of someone delivering eulogy speeches for fallen warriors, holds the record for longest confirmed sniper kill in special operations history. 2,137 meters through mountainous terrain in conditions that would challenge equipment specifications and human capability beyond normal operational parameters. The revelation struck Jimenez like incoming rocket-propelled grenades, his compact frame seeming to shrink as the reality of his miscalculations penetrated his consciousness. His earlier jokes about staplers and printers now seemed not merely inappropriate but criminally ignorant, while his assumptions about gender-based limitations crumbled like sand castles before incoming tides of professional reality. Chief Delacroix's massive frame moved closer to the group as he prepared to deliver information that would complete their understanding of exactly whom they had been systematically disrespecting for the past hour. Her call sign Green Lady, he announced with the kind of reverence typically reserved for battlefield memorials, comes from her ability to remain motionless in hostile terrain for days at a time, invisible to enemy forces while conducting surveillance and elimination operations that save countless American lives in places where congressional oversight extends only to casualty notifications. The morning sun seemed to intensify its heat as the full magnitude of their situation became apparent to the candidates, their earlier confidence transforming into something approaching terror as they realized they had been mocking a legendary figure in the special operations community. The sound of distant gunfire from training ranges now seemed to emphasize rather than background the approaching consequences of their systematic disrespect. Command Master Chief Blake stepped forward to add her perspective to the educational process that was permanently altering these young men's understanding of military service and combat excellence. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, she announced With the authority of someone who had witnessed the evolution of special operation from theory to reality, has been awarded 3 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, and the Navy Cross for actions that remain classified, but resulted in the successful completion of missions that prevented American casualties and civilian losses in multiple theaters of operation. The information struck Matthews like incoming artillery, his muscular frame trembling slightly as the magnitude of his miscalculations became apparent. His earlier comments about administrative assignments and support functions now seemed not merely wrong, but dangerously ignorant, while his assumptions about current threats and modern combat techniques crumbled before the reality of someone whose experience extended far beyond his ability to comprehend. Lieutenant Colonel Webb moved to complete the circle of revelation that would reshape these candidates' understanding of military respect permanently. Green Lady's operational record, he announced with the gravity of someone delivering classified briefings to cabinet-level officials, includes successful completion of 43 deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, elimination of 17 high-value targets whose deaths disrupted enemy operations across 3 different theaters, an extraction of American personnel from hostile territory under conditions that challenged human endurance and equipment capabilities beyond manufacturer specifications. The candidates stood frozen in place like statues commemorating military disasters, their earlier laughter now seeming not merely inappropriate, but criminally disrespectful given the magnitude of their miscalculations. The morning breeze carried the scent of cordite from distant training exercises, creating an almost ceremonial atmosphere as the full scope of Lieutenant Commander Vasquez's qualifications became apparent to young men who had spent the morning systematically destroying their own military careers. Vasquez herself remained motionless throughout the revelation of her credentials, her dark eyes holding depths that spoke of operations conducted in places where American interests were protected through decisive action rather than diplomatic negotiation. Her weathered face showed the kind of composure that came from surviving situations where panic meant death, and clear thinking represented the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure for operations that would never receive public recognition or media coverage. The heat continued building as the sun approached its daily zenith, transforming the concrete training area into a furnace that seemed to emphasize the approaching consequences for candidates who had learned too late that assumptions about military service and combat experience could prove more dangerous than any enemy fire they might someday face in operational environments where respect was earned through performance rather than presumption. The silence that followed the revelation of Vasquez's credentials stretched across the training compound like the aftermath of explosive detonations, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the seawall and the mechanical whine of aircraft engines preparing for missions that would test other warriors in environments where respect was earned through blood rather than rhetoric. The candidates stood frozen in positions that resembled statues commemorating military disasters, their earlier confidence transformed into something approaching existential terror. Vasquez finally spoke, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had whispered instructions to warriors conducting operations in places where congressional oversight extended only to classified briefings and casualty reports. The Green Lady call sign, she said with the kind of measured precision that came from years of delivering situation reports under hostile fire, was earned during my 3rd deployment to Afghanistan when I spent 17 consecutive days in a ghillie suit observing Taliban leadership compounds without moving more than 6 inches from my initial position. Her words fell into the morning air like precision munitions, each syllable adding explosive force to the growing realization among the candidates that they had been systematically destroying their military careers through disrespect directed toward a living legend in the special operations community. Kowalski's face went ashen as the magnitude of his miscalculations became apparent, while his earlier swagger transformed in a trembling that spoke of approaching consequences beyond his ability to comprehend. The temperature, she continued with the same methodical delivery that had once coordinated elimination operations across hostile territory, reached 123 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours, while nighttime temperatures dropped to 41 degrees. I maintained position through sandstorms that reduced visibility to less than 10 meters, observed enemy movements that resulted in successful interdiction of 3 planned attacks against American installations, and eliminated 4 high-value targets whose deaths disrupted enemy operations across the entire regional command structure. Matthews felt his knees weaken as the reality of his situation penetrated his consciousness like incoming artillery rounds. His earlier comments about administrative assignments and support functions now seemed not merely wrong, but criminally ignorant, while his assumptions about gender-based limitations crumbled before the testimony of someone whose performance under fire had shaped American military operations in ways he would never be clear to understand fully. My longest confirmed kill. Vasquez continued with the kind of clinical precision that marked professional warriors discussing technical achievements. Occurred at a range of 2,137 meters during conditions that challenged both equipment specifications and human capability. The target was a Taliban commander whose elimination prevented a planned attack against a convoy carrying wounded American personnel to medical evacuation facilities. Wind speed exceeded 15 knots with variable direction changes. Temperature differential affected ballistic calculations by factors requiring real-time adjustment, and the shot was completed during a window of opportunity that lasted less than 4 seconds. Hendricks found himself struggling to remain upright as the full scope of his miscalculations became apparent through testimony that transformed his assumptions about military service into evidence of his own ignorance. His baby face showed the kind of shock comprehension typically reserved for soldiers experiencing their first exposure to actual combat, while his earlier jokes about combat stress and administrative experience seemed to echo in his memory like accusations of criminal disrespect. The ghillie suit, she explained with the same methodical attention to detail that had once saved American lives in hostile territory, was constructed from local vegetation that required daily replacement to maintain effective camouflage. During the 17-day observation period, I consumed less than 2 liters of water per day, maintained body temperature through breathing techniques developed for extreme environmental operations, and documented enemy movements that resulted in successful air strikes against 43 separate targets identified through my surveillance efforts. Morrison's freckled face went pale as the implications of her testimony penetrated his consciousness like mortar rounds impacting friendly positions. His earlier observations about combat stress and gender-based performance limitations now seemed not merely inappropriate, but evidence of ignorance, so profound it bordered on criminal negligence. While his assumptions about rear echelon assignments crumbled before the reality of operations conducted in places where survival depended on skills these candidates had never imagined. The enemy forces, Vasquez continued with the kind of professional composure that came from delivering classified briefings to congressional oversight committees, included approximately 200 Taliban fighters armed with automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and improvised explosive devices strategically positioned to maximize casualties among American personnel. My elimination of their command structure prevented coordinated attacks that would have resulted in significant American losses during operations that remained classified, but contributed to the successful completion of regional stability objectives. Jimenez felt his compact frame trembling as the magnitude of his situation became apparent through testimony that transformed his earlier entertainment into evidence of systematic disrespect toward a warrior whose qualifications extended far beyond his ability to comprehend. His jokes about staplers and printers now seemed not merely inappropriate, but criminally ignorant, while his assumptions about administrative assignments crumbled like sand fortifications before incoming tides of professional reality. Chief Delacroix stepped forward to add his perspective to the educational process that was permanently reshaping these candidates' understanding of military service and combat excellence. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, he announced with the kind of reverence typically reserved for battlefield memorials, holds instructor certifications in advanced marksmanship, close quarters combat, explosive ordnance disposal, battlefield medicine, survival techniques, and psychological operations that have been used to train special operations personnel across all branches of military service. The information struck the candidates like lightning from clear skies, their assumptions about instructor qualifications and training currency crumbling before the reality of someone whose experience encompassed virtually every aspect of special operations warfare. The morning sun seemed to intensify its heat as the full scope of their miscalculations became apparent to young men who had spent precious time systematically destroying their own military careers through ignorance that bordered on criminal negligence. Master Chief Torres moved closer to complete the circle of revelation that would reshape their understanding of military respect permanently. Her training philosophy, he announced with the gravity of someone delivering classified briefings to cabinet-level officials, is based on 14 years of operational experience in environments where mistakes carried consequences measured in body counts rather than training scores. Every technique she teaches has been tested under hostile fire conditions against enemies who possess the capability to permanently adjust the attitudes of anyone who underestimated their resolve or capability. The candidates remained frozen in place like monuments to military disasters, their earlier laughter now seeming not merely inappropriate, but evidence of disrespect so profound it challenged their continued existence in military service. The morning breeze carried sounds from distant training exercises that now seemed to emphasize rather than background the approaching consequences of systematic mockery directed towards someone whose qualifications have been earned through performance in places where respect was purchased with blood rather than awarded through presumption. The transformation in the candidates' demeanor was immediate and absolute. Their earlier swagger, dissolving like morning mist before the harsh reality of professional consequences that would reshape their understanding of military service permanently. Kowalski was the first to attempt recovery from the catastrophic situation they had created through systematic disrespect, his voice trembling with the kind of desperation typically reserved for soldiers facing overwhelming enemy forces. "Ma'am," he stammered, his earlier confidence transformed into something approaching panic as the magnitude of his miscalculations became apparent through testimony that had destroyed every assumption he possessed about military hierarchy and combat experience. "I apologize for our completely inappropriate behavior and comments. We had no understanding of your qualifications or service record, and our disrespect was inexcusable regardless of any assumptions we might have made about training assignments or instructor backgrounds." Vasquez regarded him with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout their systematic assault on her credibility, her dark eyes holding depths that spoke of operations conducted in places where apologies carried less weight than performance under fire. The morning sun continued its relentless climb toward zenith, creating harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the approaching consequences for young men who had learned too late that respect was earned rather than assumed. Matthew stepped forward with movements that suggested his muscular frame was struggling to support the weight of his professional shame, his voice barely above a whisper as he attempted to address the legendary warrior he had spent precious time systematically insulting. "Lieutenant Commander Vasquez," he said with trembling uncertainty, his earlier aggressive confidence replaced by terror that bordered on complete psychological collapse. "I cannot begin to express how profoundly sorry I am for questioning your qualifications and making assumptions about your service record that were not only wrong, but criminally disrespectful." The apology hung in the morning air like smoke from distant battles, carrying implications that extended far beyond simple acknowledgement of error into territory that touched upon fundamental questions of military bearing and professional respect. Chief Delacroix's massive frame remained tense as he observed the candidate's attempts at recovery, his scarred face showing the kind of expression that suggested educational opportunities were far from complete. Hendricks found himself struggling to form coherent sentences as the full scope of his situation penetrated his consciousness like incoming mortar rounds, his baby face showing the kind of shocked comprehension that marked his transition from ignorant candidate to properly humbled student. "Ma'am," he managed to whisper through vocal cords that seemed to have contracted under the weight of professional shame, "I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life, and I understand that our behavior represents the kind of disrespect that challenges our continued participation in military service." Morrison's freckled features showed evidence of tears as his Tennessee confidence crumbled before the reality of consequences that would follow him throughout whatever remained of his military career. "Lieutenant Commander," he said with voice breaking under emotional pressure that seemed to squeeze word from his chest like physical trauma, "I am ashamed beyond description of my comments and assumptions, and I recognize that our entertainment came at the expense of disrespecting someone whose service and sacrifice represent everything we should aspire to achieve during our military careers. Jimenez appeared to be hyperventilating as the magnitude of his situation became apparent through testimony that had transformed his earlier jokes into evidence of systematic disrespect toward a living legend in the special operations community. "Ma'am," he gasped between labored breaths that suggested approaching panic attack, "I cannot comprehend how we could have been so wrong about everything, and I understand that our behavior represents the kind of ignorance and disrespect that should result in immediate separation from military service regardless of any previous achievements or potential we might have demonstrated." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward to address the educational process that had permanently altered these young men's understanding of military hierarchy and professional respect. "Gentlemen," he announced with the gravity of someone delivering final judgments in court-martial proceedings, "you have received a demonstration in humility that will either reshape your approach to military service or result in your immediate separation from special operations training, depending upon your ability to learn from this experience and demonstrate genuine transformation in your attitudes and behavior." Master Chief Torres moved closer to add his perspective to the consequences that would follow these candidates throughout their remaining time in military service. "Your assumptions about gender-based limitations, administrative assignments, and combat experience," he said with the kind of clinical precision typically reserved for after-action reports following catastrophic failures, "have been systematically destroyed through exposure to reality that should reshape your understanding of military service and professional respect permanently." Command Master Chief Blake stepped forward to complete the educational process that had transformed entertainment into evidence of systematic disrespect requiring immediate correction. "Lieutenant Commander Vasquez," she announced with reverence typically reserved for battlefield memorials, "will indeed be conducting your advanced marksmanship training over the next 6 weeks, during which time you'll have the opportunity to learn from someone whose qualifications extend far beyond your current ability to comprehend fully." Lieutenant Colonel Webb delivered the final assessment that would determine these candidates' future participation in special operations training. "Your behavior this morning," he said with the weight of absolute authority, "represents either a teachable moment that will contribute to your development as professional warriors or evidence of character deficiencies that preclude your continued participation in programs requiring maturity, respect, and professional bearing under all circumstances." Vasquez finally addressed the candidates directly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through performance in places where mistakes carried consequences measured in lives rather than training scores. "Gentlemen," she said with measured precision that commanded absolute attention, "you will report to the Advanced Marksmanship course at 0600 hours tomorrow morning, prepared to learn techniques that have been tested under hostile fire conditions. Your ability to demonstrate respect, attention to detail, and willingness to learn from someone whose experience encompasses operations you may never be clear to understand will determine your continued participation in special operations training." The morning breeze carried sound from across the naval base as the daily rhythm of military operations continued around the transformed atmosphere of the training compound. The candidates stood at attention with the kind of rigid bearing that suggested complete psychological reconstruction, their earlier assumptions about military service permanently altered through exposure to reality that had challenged every belief they possessed about combat experience and professional qualifications. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment or character, or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength when others underestimated them. Sometimes the most powerful warriors are those whose true capabilities remain hidden until the moment when respect must be earned rather than assumed. The heat continued building as the sun reached its daily zenith, but the temperature seemed less oppressive than the weight of professional shame that would follow these candidates throughout their remaining military careers, serving as permanent reminder that respect was earned through performance rather than awarded through presumption about qualifications that extended far beyond their ability to comprehend.